April 1944. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and gunpowder along the sandy shore where the Japanese engineering unit was stationed. Lieutenant Colonel Sato Hiroshi sat in the command bunker, clutching a crumpled map, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Before the war, he'd been a construction engineer, used to drafting plans for bridges and concrete structures. Now, he was calculating how to destroy, plant mines, and block paths. Earlier intelligence reports made him skeptical. The Americans loved to boast about their endless industrial output, claiming they could bring entire factory assembly lines to the battlefield. Across from him sat Captain Nakamura Masao, who always boosted the troops' morale with mocking remarks. Nakamura scoffed. They think just because they've got a few car factories, they can build bridges in jungles or over the sea? Let's see. One mine, one artillery barrage, and all their steel will sink to the ocean floor. The young soldiers burst out laughing, clapping in agreement. Their laughter echoed in the small bunker, as if they were already convinced of their enemy's weakness. But Sato didn't laugh. He remembered old articles he'd read about American construction, about steel bridges stretching hundreds of meters, built in just months. Back then, he'd admired their efficiency and speed. But now, in war, that admiration turned to worry. He stayed quiet, gave a slight nod, and said, "We'll see what's real when they face the battlefield." Deep down, he wanted to observe rather than jump to conclusions. Not far off, across the horizon, on American transport ships, Lieutenant Jack Carlson of the 249th Engineer Battalion was checking supplies. Giant rubber pontoons, steel bridge panels, pre-painted Bailey Bridge sections, all neatly stacked like a mobile factory. Carlson, a young engineer from Ohio, knew they had little time. If the American forces landed successfully, they'd need to build a bridge overnight to get tanks and supplies across the deep channel blocking their path. He lowered his voice to his crew, tying down a rope as he said, "The Japanese call us an industrial machine. They'll be in for a shock when they see us turn this steel into a bridge in just hours." The engineers nodded, sweat beading on their foreheads, but their eyes burned with determination. Night fell. The Japanese engineering unit sent scouts to the water's edge. Sato led a few men, slipping through rows of palm trees, silently watching from afar. Under the faint glow of flares, he saw flickering lights and the shadowy figures of Americans working frantically. The sound of hammers, clanging metal, and the whine of steel cables mixed with the crashing waves. Instead of noisy factory assembly lines, he saw a living machine operating right on the battlefield. Sato gripped his binoculars, noting every detail: lightweight materials, bridge sections snapping together like toy blocks, and a relentless pace of work. Nakamura, the other hand, sneered. "It's just a show. They're throwing up some floating rafts to trick us. We'll blow them apart with mines." But Sato wasn't so sure. He ordered the mine team to hold off, to watch through the night instead of acting right away. He wanted to see if the Americans' boasts would actually come true. Meanwhile, on the American side, Carlson kept pushing his men. Under sporadic Japanese artillery fire, some bridge sections were damaged just after being set up. Instead of giving up, the engineers swapped in new panels, reinforced joints, and hauled more pontoons from the transport ships. They worked almost silently, with only shouts of "pull" or "hold it" ringing out in rhythm. Time wasn't on their side. Carlson knew that at dawn Japanese artillery would have a clearer shot, and the bridge would be an easy target. Every minute, every hour of the night was precious. Around midnight, Japanese shells pounded the water. One exploded near a pontoon, knocking a few Americans into the sea. Cries for help rang out, but two soldiers instantly jumped in to pull their buddies up, then got right back to work like nothing happened. Sato watched through his binoculars, stunned. In his mind, the image of American industrial arrogance gave way to a new reality. This was persistence and teamwork on a terrifying level. As the night wore on, the floating bridge grew longer. Pontoons linked up in a chain, steel and wooden decking stretched across, anchored firmly to the shore. Carlson, panting, looked at the dozens of meters of bridge taking shape and felt a surge of confidence in his chest. He knew if the bridge was finished, it would be a lifeline for the American advance. Back at the Japanese bunker, Sato returned with a grim face, no longer as confident as before. He muttered to Nakamura, "By morning we'll know the truth. Is this an illusion or proof of America's real industrial strength?" Nakamura forced a laugh, but doubt was creeping in. The sound of hammers, cables, and waves blended into the steady rhythm of a mobile factory operating in the dark of war. Dawn was approaching, and with it, the truth about America's industrial speed on the battlefield would be revealed. The sky slowly brightened. The first streaks of dawn spread across the sea, chasing away the last bits of darkness. A thin mist hung over the cold water, but in the distance, a strange sight stood out. A floating bridge the American engineers had worked on all night. It stretched from the shore nearly halfway across the channel, dozens of pontoons linked together with steel and wooden decking glinting in the early light. To the American soldiers, it was a triumph of grit, but to the Japanese, it was an unbelievable sight, like a dream turned real right before their eyes. Lieutenant Colonel Sato Hiroshi stood on a small hill, looking down. He gripped his binoculars, his breathing slow. Last night, he'd been half doubting. Now, the image was undeniable. A real bridge had risen in just one night. Behind him, Captain Nakamura Masao held his own binoculars. At first mocking, they just slapped some rafts together. But when he saw American trucks starting to roll across the bridge, with soldiers directing traffic on both sides, Nakamura fell silent. That silence was heavy, as if all his earlier taunts had been erased by reality. Below, the American engineers kept at it. Lieutenant Jack Carlson, eyes red-shot from staying up, pointed and shouted orders to haul more pontoons to extend the bridge. A small crane from a transport ship was lowering steel beams to reinforce it. He yelled over the noise, "Hurry up! We need to finish the rest before their artillery wakes up." The soldiers worked fast, sweat soaking their shirts, but their movements were smooth, like they'd rehearsed it 100 times. A Japanese shell suddenly exploded a few meters from the bridge. Water sprayed everywhere, shaking the pontoon line. A few Americans stumbled, but they got up and kept securing cables. Carlson ran out onto the bridge, shouting, "Hold it steady! Anchor it!" And unbelievably, within minutes, the misaligned section was fixed, as solid as before. That kind of spirit made even Sato sigh. He whispered to himself, "This isn't just industry, it's discipline and belief." On the Japanese side, the engineers gathered, watching. Some whispered, their eyes full of unease. A young corporal muttered, "They built a huge bridge like that in just hours. It takes us a whole day to build a wooden one over a ditch." A sharp rebuke from an officer cut him off, but the words had already planted seeds of doubt. As the sun climbed higher, the bridge nearly spanned the entire channel. American trucks lined up, carrying ammo, food, and light tanks. The soldiers cheered and slapped each other's shoulders, even as artillery fire echoed nearby. A few P-47 fighters circled overhead, dropping bombs on Japanese gun positions to protect the bridge. Carlson, hands still greasy, looked at the line of trucks and felt his heart race. He knew they hadn't just built a bridge, they'd proven what American industry and teamwork could do. In the Japanese bunker, the mood was dark. Nakamura tried to sound tough. "We can destroy at any time. More shells, some bombs, and it's gone." But Sato shook his head. "Don't you see? They build fast, and they can rebuild faster. Blowing up one bridge won't stop them. The real problem is that they can rebuild anywhere, anytime. That's what's terrifying." His words silenced the bunker. No one dared to respond because they knew it was true. Outside, local villagers caught up in the war were just as stunned.
They'd heard about American industry through propaganda leaflets, but now they saw it. Steel beams, wooden planks, massive pontoons pieced together into a lifeline overnight. They whispered to each other, their eyes wide with awe and fear. Carlson finally slumped against a pontoon, looking up at the bright sky. He felt the rumble of tanks crossing the bridge under his feet. He thought of his dad, a factory worker in Detroit, who once said, "Americans can do anything if we work together." Here, in the middle of a war zone, those words hit home. Sato lowered his binoculars and took a deep breath. He knew the war would be long and brutal, but one thing was clear. The mocking of American industry that Japanese officers had clung to was just self-delusion. Before him, the bridge stood as proof that raw power and technical skill could shift the tide of war in an instant. He turned to Nakamura, his voice low. "We just watched the enemy turn steel into a road in one night. Never underestimate them again." As the sun fully rose, the beach glowed, and the bridge stretched like a steel scar across the water. It wasn't just a feat of engineering, it was a symbol of a new era of warfare, where industry and speed were as deadly as guns and bullets.
In 1943-44, as fighting raged in New Guinea and later the Philippines, the Japanese believed rugged terrain, rivers, and jungles would be their allies. In their traditional military thinking, a deep, wide river could halt an armored column for days, even weeks. Japanese officers thought the Americans, seen as slow, machine-dependent, and weighed down by logistics, would get stuck. They couldn't imagine an enemy turning night into a workshop, building river-crossing bridges in mere hours. Japanese scout reports captured their shock. One team watched Americans approach a wide river. By day, they saw Sherman tanks, 105mm guns, and supply trucks stopped at the bank. "It'll take them days to cross," an officer confidently said. But by morning, they were stunned to see a pontoon bridge stretching hundreds of meters, strong enough for heavy vehicles to roll across. One Japanese officer wrote in a report, "The Americans turned night into a factory. By dawn, the river was no obstacle. Tanks, artillery, and trucks poured across. We couldn't believe our eyes." What the Japanese didn't know was that behind this speed were the combat engineers, not just soldiers, but skilled builders with construction and mechanical know-how, backed by a top-notch logistics system. They were trained to assemble Bailey bridges, a British-designed modular steel system mass-produced by the Americans. These bridges used standardized parts, light enough to assemble by hand, but strong enough for heavy tanks. A coordinated team could put up a 60 to 70-meter bridge in under 12 hours, no heavy machinery needed. To the Japanese, it was like magic. At night, they heard hammers and clanging steel in the dark. By sunrise, a new bridge spanned the river, and American vehicles surged forward. Japanese special forces tried to destroy these bridges, but even when they succeeded, the Americans rebuilt another in half a day. Sometimes the Americans built two bridges side by side, so if one was hit, the other took over. A captured Japanese soldier's diary had a desperate line. "We cut down one snake, but by morning, two more slithered out of the dark." This wasn't just a tactical shock. It hit the Japanese soldiers' morale. For years, they'd been taught Bushido. Human will, determination, and sacrifice could overcome anything. Now they faced a new reality. Technology, industry, and speed were deciding the war. Rumors spread through Japanese camps that the Americans could build a city in a night. That fear shook the invincible mindset their commanders had drilled into them. Those overnight bridges weren't just for crossing rivers. They opened the way for American firepower. Artillery, vehicles, and supplies crossed natural defenses the Japanese thought were unbreakable. In the 1944 Luzon campaign in the Philippines, the Japanese bet on big rivers to slow the enemy. But American engineers built a nearly 300-meter Bailey Bridge in days, opening the door for armored units to storm the Japanese defenses. Those bridges became the ultimate symbol of American industrial might, something the Japanese once laughed off. Steel beams mass-produced in Pittsburgh and Detroit, shipped thousands of miles, were pieced together in Asian jungles into sturdy bridges. It wasn't just engineering, it was a statement. Modern war belonged to those who mastered production and speed. For the Japanese, those bridges were a warning. If the Americans could build a bridge in hours, what else could they do? And as the war's final year showed, the truth would hit even harder, not just with pontoon or Bailey bridges, but with massive floating harbors that stunned the world.
If overnight Bailey and pontoon bridges shocked the Japanese, the Mulberry harbors in the final stages of World War II forced them to admit they were facing an enemy with unimaginable power. In traditional military thinking, a large-scale amphibious landing needed a fixed port to unload tanks, artillery, and thousands of tons of supplies. The Japanese believed that by destroying existing piers and fortifying coastlines, they could make beaches impregnable. But they didn't expect the Americans and their allies to bring mobile harbors right to the battlefield. The Mulberry harbors were a marvel of modern engineering. Steel causeways, floating piers, and mobile breakwaters built in England, towed across the English Channel, and assembled off Normandy's coast. Within days of the June 1944 D-Day landings, the Americans and British had a system unloading over 9,000 tons of supplies daily. For Japanese soldiers fighting in the Pacific, hearing about this was mind-blowing. One officer wrote in a report to Tokyo, "If they can build a port in the middle of the sea, no island is safe. No matter how barren a coast, they can create a logistics gateway." What stood out was that the Mulberry harbors showed a new logistics philosophy. The Americans didn't wait for nature's permission. They made their own conditions to advance. As the U.S. moved into Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Japanese hoped rugged, portless coasts would slow them down. But within days, floating piers, massive pontoon bridges, and LST ships, landing ship tank, turned the sea into temporary harbors. At night, the sounds of welding and clanging steel rang out. By dawn, a logistics network appeared along the shore, unloading Sherman tanks, 155-millimeter guns, and thousands of tons of supplies daily. A Japanese veteran from Iwo Jima later recalled, "We thought the sea would stop them. It didn't. They turned it into a highway." What terrified the Japanese wasn't just the engineering, it was the production scale behind it. While Japan struggled to build single ships or guns, the Americans mass-produced floating harbors, ready to sacrifice them if needed. When a storm wrecked one Mulberry harbor in Normandy, the Americans kept up their massive supply chain with the remaining one. It was proof of a river of steel flowing from Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, where factories ran 24/7 to feed the war. To the Japanese, those harbors rising from the sea were the ultimate proof of modern industrial power. It showed a truth they had to accept. Spirit couldn't replace infrastructure. A natural defense, a portless coast, or a remote island, none of it mattered against an enemy that could build bridges, ports, and turn the sea into a logistics hub. This was the turning point that shook the Japanese belief in willpower wins wars. They realized the war had entered a new era, one where victory wasn't just about courage, but about industry, engineering,
and terrifyingly fast infrastructure deployment.
As the Pacific War neared its end, what the Japanese had mocked became undeniable on the battlefield. They'd laughed at American factories, called U.S. workers clumsy fat guys, and believed Japan's craftsmanship, discipline, and grit were superior. But they faced a harsh truth. America's industry, its ability to mobilize a nation, mass-produce, and move at breakneck speed, created a power Japan could never match. In Europe, as the Allies pushed into Germany, U.S. supply convoys kept flowing across the Atlantic. In the Pacific, tiny islands became forward bases in weeks, with piers, fuel depots, and airstrips popping up fast. Massive pontoon bridges, built in days, let tanks and heavy guns cross rivers the Japanese thought uncrossable. Seeing it firsthand stunned Japanese soldiers. They'd believed infrastructure took months, but they had to admit the Americans did it in nights. It wasn't magic, it was the result of an industry that standardized every detail. Every steel beam, concrete block, and bridge section was like a giant Lego piece. On the battlefield, the military just hauled them out, snapped them together, and finished the job. In memoirs from Japanese POWs, they described their shock at the Mulberry harbors, portable ports towed to Europe for D-Day. To them, it was unthinkable. They couldn't fathom how America could build thousands of bombers, aircraft carriers, and feed millions of soldiers worldwide at all once. But the truth was, thanks to massive scale and organized production, America did it all. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, many officers bitterly admitted they'd misjudged their enemy. Admiral Yamamoto, who famously said, "For 6 months I'll run wild, but after that I'm not sure," from the reluctant Admiral Bayagawa, had seen it coming. Japan could win early battles, but in the long run they couldn't compete with America's industrial might. Post-war studies like Richard Overy's Why the Allies Won 1995 pointed out that victory came not just from strategy or fighting spirit, but from technical solutions to terrain, logistics, and distance challenges. After Japan's defeat, the very things they'd mocked became lessons for rebuilding. Japan adopted mass production models, learned American management science, and within 2 decades became an economic powerhouse. Wartime arrogance gave way to humility and learning. For the U.S., the legacy wasn't just victory, it was proof of industrial democracy's strength. In World War II, every American, from greasy factory workers to Rosie the Riveter women at lathes to unsung engineers designing bridge modules, helped win the war. It built a lasting belief that a nation's power lies not just in its military, but in mobilizing society. For the Japanese soldiers who mocked American clumsiness, the lesson was clear. They underestimated organization, collective creativity, and an industry that turned dreams into reality. Looking back, their downfall wasn't just battlefield losses. It was arrogance blinding them to what their enemy could do. Today, the story of Japanese soldiers mocked U.S. industry until they saw bridges rise overnight isn't just a war tale, it's a timeless lesson. Never underestimate preparation, technology, and collective spirit. Those bridges built in the night didn't just cross rivers, they bridged the belief that in war or peace, a nation can achieve the impossible by harnessing industry and people.